So I'm Jim Welch, and I compose music and make sound effects for games, as well as do a podcast, talking with other composers and sound designers and cool voice people, and that sort of thing.
Tom Salta, Game Composers Gone Wild. Take one. I am a composer and producer. I've been mainly focusing on games for the last decade.
Hi, my name is Penka Koneva. I'm a composer and orchestrator based in Los Angeles.
Hi, I'm Sam Hughes. I'm a sound designer and voice actor, and I'm predominantly working in video games.
I'm Wilbert Roger. I'm a music composer working freelance.
My name is Winifred Phillips. I'm a game composer. I've been composing music for games for over 11 years now, and I've gotten a chance to work on some fun projects, including Assassin's Creed Liberation HD, 5 games so far in the Little Big Planet franchise, Speed Racer, Spore Hero, The Maw, The Da Vinci Code, lots more. I've had a great time.
Yeah, I'm Richard Ludlow, and I think the first time that I heard anything about game audio was actually Chance Thomas. I snuck into a lecture he was giving when I wasn't attending Berklee College of Music. This was before I went there, and I snuck into one of the classes he was giving a lecture at, and he was talking about dynamic interactive music systems, and it was just, I said, wow, that's really cool. I want to do that.
I started out as a composer for a series of radio dramas called Radio Tales for National Public Radio. And as a part of that, I was creating musical scores for classic stories of science fiction and fantasy and horror, like Dracula and War of the Worlds and Beowulf, things like that, which was terrific because it was very inspiring work. But also because it's radio, there's no visual component. And when there isn't a visual component, the music can get into the listener's head a bit more and suggest what the visual component should be, create a sense of the kinetics and tell the story a bit more, pace it in a way that creates mental images. And I found that when I transitioned into video games, the idea of music creating these mental images and having that sort of intimate relationship with the player was helpful. Thinking about it that way helped me to compose music in a way that is different from the way you would think of it when it's composed to visual content like television and film, where it's very much synced to a very set linear narrative and a lot of visual cues that set the pace of the action. With video games, it's not quite that way. The music needs to tell the story in its own language on its own, in a sort of parallel prose to what the story of the game is doing. So I found myself leaning on some of the lessons I learned from my radio work.
The most burning question I get from young composers is, how do you get your first break? And I wanted, again, to express how grateful I am for the Transformers, because this was my break. And for anybody coming and working on their first game, being a AAA game, it's just an amazing luck. But again, because I knew the style of the films I was asked to compose, and we were not allowed to use any of the themes from the film because they're copywritten by the film. So it had to be very much in that style, but it had to be original music. And Steve Jablonski, to whom I owe this opportunity, composed the theme and a couple of the high combat loops, and then my job was to do a couple of big combat loops and races, chases, a bunch of cinematics, and again, keep the style very unified. So the game has a sound. That's the most important thing, that the music creates a sonic world that these characters and the story will inhabit. But again, I got the job because I knew the sound of the Transformers.
When I started at LucasArts, I had a little bit of an identity crisis because, I'd been for so long, writing music for games, and I was the guy for the game. I was just writing the music and, writing for films as well, independent films. And here I'm at LucasArts and I'm just sort of editing music, but I'm just thinking, well, there's got to be some more things that I can do for the team than this. Otherwise, I'm not going to sort of improve, skill set. So very early on, I learned that they were offering classes at ILM in Python. And I thought, oh, well, if I can script in Python, then maybe some of these things that normally take us a while, I can do like instantly. So I took the class. I'm not a great programmer at all, but that sort of opened my eyes to things. And because I studied Python, then I could kind of understand the Lua script that we were using for the Force Unleashed series. So suddenly that was like, oh, actually, I can do this. Maybe I don't need to rely on a level designer to hook this up or whatever. Because there's always that feedback loop or whatever, and the feedback loop. And maybe they'll do something wrong, and I'd have to ask them to fix it. Well, why don't I just fix it myself? So it kind of all started with that, and then from there, later on, we got Wise, the audio middleware, and we got Wise, and jokes. But yeah, so I learned Wise, and we used that for Force Unleashed 2. But what kind of happened was, we also, after Force Unleashed 2, we had new staff, and I'd already trained up in Wise, and we lost some of our staff, unfortunately. So I kind of became the sort of implementation guy. I would train new employees in Wise, and eventually that sort of became my thing, I guess. Not so much unintentionally, but sort of just serendipitously. And after a while, it came to the point where I was, kind of supervising projects. I wasn't just sort of a cog in the wheel or whatever. And I would design the music systems for, First Assault. We had a very interesting music system for that, but I can get into that later. But eventually I designed systems for, First Assault, Tomb Raider, Dead Island, and it just kind of evolves that way. It's the reason this is sort of a personal opinion answer is, a lot of people ask, do I need to learn Wise in order to write music for games? And to me, that's kind of like asking, do I need to learn how to play the piano in order to write music? I mean, like, no, but why not? Why not learn something new? Why not, know everything about the music, how it's going into the game? Because at the end of the day, someone's going to play the game. They're going to just hear the music as it's played in the game. And if something sounds stupid, it's going to make you sound stupid. So I just figure, why not, take ownership of like every step of the way. I always need help because I'm not a programmer.
It was a kind of combination of attending loads of events. I met people through the website I run, The Sound Architect, and I freelanced just off the bat, really, and kind of just worked on loads of smaller projects to begin with, and then a combination of that as well as the masters I did, I managed to get an internship to then get a 3-month junior sound designer position at TT Games, Traveller's Tales Games.
So the industry of game audio, the hardest part, and it's probably similar to any game industry job, is just getting work. I mean, the craft itself takes a lot of discipline and self-learning, self-teaching, because there's not many people out there teaching how to do it. But the hardest part is just to get the gig. And I think the challenge in that is you have to get yourself out there and you have to talk to people. And a lot of us are introverted, because if you're involved in the arts, generally you're involved in the arts because you went back to your house and did art. So it's you have to sort of break out of that shell and like become a people person. And that's a challenge, and it's still something I think even people who have been at it a while, unless you're sort of at the top tier, you still have to deal with that. But especially early on, you have to meet people, because people want to work with their friends, and that's a challenge.
I think it's just really, we're young, and it's been a learning process of budgeting in the right amount of time to take to do things, and the amount of work that things are going to take, and so just kind of navigating the whole waters of the business side of thing, because people you go to music school and they teach you about music and sound, but the whole real world aspect is a little less approached, and so we've stumbled through it and are figuring things out now.
As someone who's sort of just in the midst of small degrees, enough success to do this full time, but not quite enough success to be comfortable doing it full time. Just anyone who's kind of going out there, just network a lot. Like, it's really important, if you're interested in doing this for a living, to go out there and network, meet people. And Know it's going to be a slow process and just stick with it. And make yourself good at implementing and make yourself good at multiple things and just like make yourself valuable. I feel like that's the biggest thing people want to know when they're, if anyone's watching this trying to get into the industry, that's like, well, how do I do it? And that's sort of super important. And I know all of us get asked that a lot who work in the industry, like, how do I get started? And that's, I think, valuable to iterate, if not once, again and again and again.
I would say collaborating is one of the most important skills that any composer can develop, because we all work in a highly collaborative field. We get continuously feedback from our clients. We pass notes or instructions to our team members, and I have a large team that I work with on these large jobs. And one of the most important skills that I've learned along the way for the last 15 years is to work well with people. And I think anybody who has aspirations to become a collaborative composer, game composer, they have to be good collaborators. Anybody who is a media composer today needs to have 4 skill sets, really well developed skill sets, and that is the creative voice, being a composer, being a good collaborator, having an incredible technical fluency, and I'll come back to this, and the 4th skill set is being an entrepreneur, being kind of self-driven, because we all build our businesses. So as far as technology is concerned, I finished the conservatory. I was always trained as a musician, composer, and one of the biggest challenges in my Hollywood career has been learning technical skills. My solution for all these years has been to reach out and surround myself with most amazing people, recording engineers. I work with John Rod, who is a brilliant recording engineer, and reach out for help. The moment when I felt that my own technical skills will simply not cut it, I worked with another music producer, Chris Lord, who mixed these Transformers loops and 150 audio tracks. So again, that was my solution, but it's an ongoing process to always learn as much as I can about technology, to be really aware, to always ask questions, and just be aware that game scoring is a highly demanding technologically, and we have to be on top of it.
It's all about the human relationships, I think. I know everybody says that, but it's really true. Meeting developers and establishing that connection with them is what is going to give us, the opportunity to work on projects with them. If you're trying to go in-house, that's a different story. But if you're trying to work as a freelancer, as so many people are, it's those human connections, those relationships that you establish, you build. You work with a client once, and if they like you, they come back for years to come. So the more people that you can meet and establish, not just meet many people, but the more people you can meet and build a solid, good relationship with, I think is the best advice for getting work and moving up in the industry.
I always give really cheesy advice when I'm asked this question, and I always quote, I think it was Mark Kilborn who first said this to me many years ago, and he said, luck is the combination of preparation and opportunity. And that's obviously a proverb that's been around for a long time, but that one really stuck with me. And the best way for that to happen is that you're always prepared. So learn the stuff, learn the software. You don't have to be working in games to have the experience. It's only time at a company on a CV. You could have made games, you could have worked on games yourself, you could have made loads of reels, So constantly work on your craft. Make sure that you are doing what you love. If you're doing what you love, it won't be a chore to make your own personal videos and redesign sound for trailers and work with the middleware like Wise or Fmod or Fabric and make videos of it. And also, don't be afraid to talk to people. Like, there's this, even before I started interviewing people, there's this kind of thought process that people are out of reach. They've worked on these AAA titles and, they're amazing and you can't talk to them. And the best example of this is the first interview that we did on The Sound Architect was with Philip Kovacs, who was the audio lead on The Last of Us. And all it came from was a tweet. I literally asked him to say, would you like to be interviewed? We'd love to talk to you about the audio. And he just went, yeah, sure. And there's so many guys like that in game audio. Everyone in game audio that I've come across is mostly just so comfortable talking about what they've done, how they got there. And there's no like, oh, it's my job, you can't have it. There's none of that. Everyone just wants to help nurture the community, and everyone wants to improve game audio. So they want to help the next generation. They want everyone to be good at what they do. They don't want games to come out with rubbish audio. So they're happy to help. So just get talking to people.
Working on films and games with this, the whole thing is always a team effort. I mean, there's always more than one person involved in the process. And you have to be a really good collaborator. And I'm very comfortable collaborating with teams, regardless of what it is for. But for games, usually the audio team is much smaller than the game developer team. And, so the whole audio portion usually comes in toward the end of the project. And there's usually there's usually much fewer people involved. But you're dealing mainly with the audio director, the sound designers, and in some cases, and I love it when I can start dealing directly with the creative directors and the producers, because those are the people that really have the full, complete understanding of the vision of the game.
Well, apart from, the most important things, which are a love of music composition and a lot of experience having composed, listening to a lot of music in a way that's very open-minded, all that stuff's important. But I think that it's just, once you get to the point where you're starting to think about being in video games, the idea of just really being open to setting aside everything you've learned. It's kind of like, I suppose, boot camp when you join, you're in the Army. Not that I know that much about this, but I imagine the idea of you build yourself up with an aspiration to do something that is very challenging. But when you get into the situation, you sort of have to get torn down again and reshaped in a new way. And I think that happens to people who are composers and then move into video games. You come into it with a skill set that's suited towards composition, but then you sort of have to tear yourself down and rebuild yourself, shaping it around the needs of games and the way in which they're put together. And while that sounds kind of distressing, it's not that bad a thing to have happen to you. You learn a lot about yourself, and you become more flexible, and you discover skills and creative parts of yourself that you wouldn't have thought that you had. And I think with every composer that gets into video games and learns that they love it, there's some part of it that really speaks. Some part of the technology is exciting, some part of the creative aspect is really exciting, and that is what leads you through that process of sort of rebuilding yourself and retraining your mind to think about music in a different way. So I think that's sort of the journey you take.
Undercharging, I think, is the biggest early mistake of a composer, or further yet, not charging at all. It is necessary. I think as you start out, you need to do it for free for people doing it for free. So the biggest mistake people make is like, well, I have to get my name out there, I'll do it just for credit. If the company you're working for is selling this and making money, you should be being paid too. When you start out, work for other, assuming you're in college or not, work for college kids making games, and they're not making money and being selfish and keeping some to themselves. It's purely a learning experience, and you do need that learning experience. But once you start working for studios, research what the industry standards are. We don't like to talk about them a lot, but there is sort of standards for pay that we're all kind of ballpark making, and we don't like to publicly post it everywhere because there is still some competitive nature to it. But research and talk to people. People will mentor and talk to you personally about what, ballpark maybe, or maybe specifically what they make, or if nothing else, what they think you should charge, and value your work to a dollar amount. And if they can't pay you, then say, well, I keep rights. Pay attention to valuing your work, because it hurts everyone. It hurts that person, and it hurts me, and it hurts people doing AAA even.
Yeah, I think the whole misnomer of don't work for free, that's very valid. But I heard someone say don't work for nothing, and that's a better way to approach it. I think we just did a project that launched yesterday that we did for free with clients who had were putting together a fun parody of something, and they weren't getting paid, they were just doing it for fun, and they asked us if we wanted to join in, and we said okay. And since then, they've become a great client. They've given us, paid work, and they've referred us twice now to big new clients that we have, and we've established an amazing relationship with them just doing this project that they weren't getting paid on either. So I think, finding something in it, be it, the contacts, the great experience, the community that you can become integrated with other students, working for free on a big budget game that is paying everyone else working on it, that's I think detrimental to everyone, but including yourself. But if you can find a way to not work for nothing, then I think that's fine. I realized a while ago, like, being blunt and just asking people about money was a really good way, because no one wanted to talk about numbers. No one wants to say, oh, I'm making this much on a game, or I'm charging this much. But without people who are starting out having some basis, I mean, how do we know what to charge? How do we know how that whole process works? So I just started asking people, and surprisingly, most people are pretty open to talking about at least general numbers and figures, and it's we figured it out, and eventually, as you work on more projects, we figure out our time is worth this much money, and it takes us this long to do something. So it's we've just figured it out as we go along. Yeah, the industry has seemed to have shifted a little bit from 10 years ago. Everyone was only signing work for hire contracts, but the boom of the indie world right now means that there's so many people making games, and a lot of those people don't have the budgets to make their game from start to finish. But these are people who are making amazingly creative experiences, and who, if they don't have great music or sound, aren't going to be putting out a great product. So it's really about finding a developer that you believe in, and you can take that risk with them. And so agreements in that regard look a little different sometimes. Sometimes they have a profit sharing aspect, and then it's like you're taking a risk, but if you really believe in the project and it does well, and you have a back-end percentage, or you do a license agreement for less money, that can really work out. But there's just so much going on right now, and so much shifting in the way that the industry works, that agreements look very different across the board with indie projects and AAA now.
Currently, I'm moving with the indie titles that when they contact me, it's generally very, very small budgets. And in the past, I've always thought, okay, well, we're using samples. Now what sound do you want? It's going to be samples regardless. But I am in the process of trying to shift that dynamic and try to talk to them and say, well, you should use live instruments, unless it's like a rock score or an electronic score, which are less frequent than the orchestral scores. I say, all right, well, here's your budget. We should use live players, and we should work towards the instrumentation we can afford. But most people, including myself previously, it's just samples. You switch, and maybe you'll hire one string player to add into your string section, but yeah. So I'm doing music and sound effects because the small developers can't hire two people. I'm lucky if they'll hire one person. Generally, small studios want a programmer to go on freesound.org or take their Zoom and go record some sound effects. And it's, especially where I'm at in Dallas, it's really a prominent problem. It's just not quite the respect it gets out in California or some of the larger studios who know it should be an expert doing these things. So if someone will hire me, or anyone, then it's generally one person, and they're doing the music and sound effects for the small studios.
I always hesitate before I start dishing out advice to young composers, because you never know who's listening, where they are in their life, and that one thing you say can completely change the trajectory of their career. So I think first and foremost, it's important to tell young people who are really inspired to get into this part of the business that they need to remain excited, they need to remain passionate about the art of creating music for games, right? That's first and foremost. And once you go past that, then it's different for every person. You know, the common advice on the street is, you know what you're good at, stick to that, become identified for that, and you can base your career off that. It's probably true for most cases, but I don't like saying that's the way, you know, because if anybody knows that there are exceptions to the rules in every rule, that would be me, because I am the exception to almost every rule when it comes down to a career in music. I don't follow the path that most people have followed, and I get caught in situations that most people never get into. You know, even if I were to just look at games, my career in gaming alone, just the way I started out, you know, this whole Atlas Plug thing, being an artist, at the time, no one did that. You know, you were either a composer or you're an artist. You didn't say, well, I want to be a composer, so let me be an artist first, and then I'll become, you know, I mean, it happens to people, right? You know, Danny Elfman was Oingo Boingo, and then Tim Burton talked him into scoring Pee-wee's Big Adventure. But I heard him say, I believe in an interview, that it wasn't, you know, he didn't like say, oh, I want to be a big composer. I think he was a bit resistant almost at first. You know, for me, it was really different. I didn't know where I was going to land. I didn't know where I was going to start. I just know what I wanted to do. And I think it's important to be flexible in anything you do, you know. Like they say, you know, be more like bamboo. You want to be flexible. You want to be able to bend. Don't be so rigid, you know. But I also know the importance of being able to be identified. You know, if no one knows what to do with you, no one's going to do anything with you, right? And perhaps that's why, you know, even actors get typecast a lot. You know, because these days in Hollywood, there's very little creativity, there's very little vision, there's very little risk-taking, especially in the mainstream, big budget stuff, because they don't want to, you know, there's millions and millions and millions of dollars involved, and no one wants to take any risks, right? They have investors, they want, you know, it's not about the art anymore, it's about the sales. It's about, well, we're putting this much, so we need at least this many ticket sales. And it's the same with anything else. And it's the same with composers. I mean, when you start talking about big budget games, millions of dollars, they don't want to take a risk with someone who has done a variety of things. I mean, unless you have a really good relationship with somebody, which fortunately I do now, they're usually going to go to the guy who has done it before, or something closely tied to it. And so that's the argument for, you know, figuring out what you're good at and doing just that, because then you have a better chance of getting really good at one thing. You know, the more time you put into something, the better you get at it. So if you divide that up between 5 different things, you know, the current thinking is that you'll be 5 times slower to get really good at all those things, like a jack of all trades. But in rare cases, I think it can be an asset. It just might take a little longer to develop. And I think that's potentially what happened with me. You know, people were trying to typecast me right away, and I can't tell you how many times I got advice from people. Oh yeah, you're an electronic dude, right? You stick to all the loops. Yeah, stick to that. Don't get into scoring, you know? And then 1 year later, I do Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter, which was opposite of, you know, and then you know, Prince of Persia, which is completely different. You know, the score for that one, it was non-orchestral, it was more atmospheric and more like Peter Gabriel's The Temptation of the Christ, and there was no orchestral instruments in it. There was no what you would normally expect in an epic, you know, Persian style game. I love breaking the rules. I love transforming musically into someone that you've never seen before. Red Steel, I mean, that score alone, and I'm so thankful to the music director in that, because he encouraged experimentation. I mean, just that one score alone went from you know, sure, epic choral Japanese music, but then it had rock, and then it had J-pop, and then it had 70s funk, and then it had like a authentic sounding 70s love song sung in Japanese. And it had like, lounge music in it. It had everything in it. It went all, it had electronic, it had industrial music in it. So I love transforming. I mean, that for me, that's the adventure, right? I get bored really easily doing the same thing all the time. So I encourage and I love jumping into, being trusted with a huge project, having to create that unique identity and transforming like a great actor can transform. There's some actors who you see who it's like, I cannot believe that's Dustin Hoffman. I can that's the same guy. I cannot believe that. And they could just not just visually, but just the whole persona, and that's the kind of composer and producer that I try to be when I'm working on a game project.
Right now, the industry, like I said, is really changing and shifting, and there's so much opportunity. I think a composer who's just graduating from school or a sound designer who wants to go into the film world has a lot more barriers to entry because of the established environment there. But with the game world, there's so many young, innovative indie developers out there. So the biggest challenge, I guess, is finding them, because the work is there, the opportunity is there. But it's all about making those personal connections with developers that you can start a collaborative process with. There's less so in the film or commercial production world, but in the game world, there's a lot of opportunity, and it's just finding it and establishing great relationships with those people.